Good afternoon and Happy New Year to everyone, both in person and tuning in. This is the Energy Program's first public event of the year, so I'm very excited to welcome all of you to really listen to some amazing analytical work that our colleagues at APERC, Asia Pacific Economic Research, and Asia Pacific Energy Research Center based in Tokyo has been doing. Today, we have two researchers from Tokyo, and they will walk us through on some key energy trends in this very dynamic region. As many of you may know, the APEC itself is a 21-member economy entity. And it really has an extremely diverse set of economies, right? So some of us, or some of the member economies are, highly sort of oil gas rich, such as the United States, Canada, Australia. There are also economies that are very rich in mineral resources, like Chile. And then there are those within Asia that have very different economic profiles, those in Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. So it's a huge region, very dynamic, and I'm just very excited that we have sort of a first-hand opportunity to hear what the trends are, but then also do a little sort of a deep dive into both China and Southeast Asia. And so first, we will have the presentation, first by Glen Sweetnam, who is a Senior Vice President of APERC, and then he'll be joined by Yasmin Fouladi, who is the leading researcher there. And I just realized I forgot to introduce myself, Jane Nakano. I'm Senior Fellow with CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program. And again, welcome to our event, and then the floor is yours, Glen. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. I'm very pleased to be here and so happy to be able to share the results of our recently released outlook with you. So what I'm going to do is present the results for APEC as a whole, and then my colleague Yasmin Fouladi will present results for China and Southeast Asia. So the Asia Pacific Energy Research Center was established by APEC in 1996, and its primary purpose is to provide analytic support to the Energy Working Group of APEC. And as Jane mentioned, it's 21 member economies around the Pacific Rim. Hong Kong, China, and Chinese Taipei are independent members. And in our work, we're supporting all of them on their energy trends. So we're just released the Energy Outlook, the 9th edition. It is a priority task under the Energy Action Program of APEC. And in this time, our projections go out to 2060. And we have two scenarios. One is a reference scenario where the pathway on energy mix, energy use, and emissions reductions is related to historical trends and existing legislation, very similar to the current policies case, current policy scenario of the IEA. But then we have a target scenario where we come up with a pathway that allows each economy to reach its energy mix and emissions goals. And so that's not necessarily the official, it is not the official government plan, but it does reflect, and we work closely with the economy to try and reflect their goals out through 2060. So to look at the energy system, we have a model, open source model. We look at demand side. We model energy demand in 5 sectors. The energy demand is driven by population and GDP. And from those 5 demand models, then we derive fuel or energy requirements by fuel. Those requirements are passed back to the transformation sector, which includes heat and power, refining, and hydrogen. Some of the supply is, of course, comes straight from direct natural gas and oil. That goes to supply. And the transformation sector passes its demands back to the supply sector. So then this is what the energy flows look like in 2022 for APEC as a whole. So one of the things that makes our work a little bit unusual is that we develop an energy model for each economy individually, and then the APEC total is not a top-down but a bottom-up. We just simply add the results for each of the economies. So you can see in 2022, and I need to point out that in the lower right-hand side, you'll see 50,000 petajoules. That's about the thickness of it. So you can see the coal, that black production of coal in APEC is about 150,000 petajoules, which is about 75 million barrels a day of oil equivalent. So major energy source for APEC. And so you can see how important coal and oil in purple and natural gas in blue are. The red is nuclear, yellow, very thin yellow ribbon is wind and solar, the green is hydro and biofuels. Now, so then if we look at how things have changed, you'll see if we look out to 2060 in the reference case, you'll see that the coal section went down considerably, cut in half, and that's just in the reference case. And then as we go to the target case, you'll see that in the transport sector, we have a reduction in petroleum liquids, petroleum products, and an increase in the electricity to the transport sector. And it turns out the transport sector is really the area where the economies of APEC plan to reduce carbon emissions and increase efficiency. And that's because internal combustion engines are only a third as efficient, or I should say that electric vehicles are 3 times as efficient as internal combustion engines. So in terms of energy consumption, the energy consumption in the transport sector goes down, and so that's why that blue electricity ribbon doesn't need to be as thick as the petroleum product ribbon, or flow. You also notice in this flow how much nuclear is increased and how much the wind and solar is increased, and I'll get into the specific numbers next. So as I mentioned, population and GDP drive our projection. Population is about 3 billion people in APEC right now, representing about 60% of the world's energy use. And you can see by sector, the industrial sector remains the largest sector of energy use in APEC in the reference case and in the target case. In the reference case, we do see a plateauing of demand out in the late 2030s. And this is related to reduced transport demand. You can see how the blue gets a little bit smaller from the electric vehicles. In the target case, industry stays large, but we have a much greater reduction in energy use in the transport sector, also more efficiency in the building sector. Industry a little bit more efficient, but most of the efficiency increases are in transport and in the building sector. So how are we going to fuel this energy demand? This shows the energy consumption by fuel. And what jumps out, of course, is the electricity, which in 2022 is a relatively small part of the energy mix, becomes a dominant part of the energy mix by 2060. You can also see natural gas maintaining a role, but especially in the target case, you can see how the petroleum liquids decline. And so in the reference case, electricity use increases by 75% from 2022 to 2060. In the target case, it increases by 96%. And in that case, oil use drops by 50% in APEC. So then, how are we going to generate all this electricity? This is the electricity generation by technology. You can see how small the wind and solar, which is the blue and yellow, in 2022 is, but then you can see it grows dramatically, increasing 6-fold in the reference case, increasing 8-fold in the target case. And so the share of the variable renewable energy, the wind and solar, increases from 12% of electricity generation up to 42% in the reference case and 50% in the target case. The share of dispatchable power, and this is the gas, coal, hydro, and nuclear decreases somewhat, but what's mattering is that the share is decreasing a lot. So the share of dispatchable generation decreases from 88% down to 58% in the reference and 50% in the target. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the key takeaways from this work. So in absolute terms, dispatchable generation grows slightly, but it shifts away from fossil fuels to low carbon or zero carbon sources like nuclear and hydro. So in terms of the key takeaways from our work, we use the energy trilemma, which is trying to achieve sustainability, energy security, grid reliability, and affordability. And our key proxies for that are CO2 emissions, import dependence for energy security, grid stability or grid reliability, and then also cost for affordability. So in terms of APEC as a whole, in the reference case, CO2 emissions declined by 22% by 2060 in the reference case. In the target case, they fall by 2/3, a 67% drop in CO2 emissions. And as I mentioned, this is, although all the sectors have some efficiency gains, the primary reduction in CO2 emissions is in the transportation sector. In terms of energy security, we wanted to look at import dependence. Now, as Jane mentioned, APEC as a whole is very diverse, so we have large exporters as well as large importers. So to look at the energy security issue, we just looked at an importing group of economies, and we set up that group by just saying which economies were importing a specific fuel in 2030, and we put them in the importing group. So 14 of the 21 economies import coal in 2030, 16 petroleum liquids, either crude or petroleum products, and 13% natural gas. So 13 economies natural gas. So if we look just at those importing economies, then the bars in blue are for the reference case, orange for the target case, the bars are the quantity, the black line is the share. So you can see the share of coal dependence is low, 16 to 18% in the two cases, so not a large energy security risk there. But in the petroleum liquids, we can see that we have a ramp up still and then a peak and decline in petroleum liquid use, but the import dependence for the import economy still stays at above 80%. And then it declines in the target case, but just down to 70%. And then finally, in natural gas, we can see a strong increase in natural gas consumption. That becomes the most important fossil fuel in the APEC region. And also import dependence getting up to 70% for these importing economies in the reference case, 60% in the target case. So the next issue we wanted to look at was grid reliability. And the issue there, APEC economies, especially the non-OECD economies, are noticing how, as we increasingly rely on renewables in the OECD, the costs of electricity are going up, which is a little bit surprising because wind and solar is such a low cost, equipment is so low. And so that's one of the things we struggled with and tried to explain. And what we've realized is that to keep grid stability, you need to have dispatchable capacity equal to net load. So what we've shown here, and these are model results, the blue is 2022, the light gray is the reference case, the red is the target case. So if we look first at the blue, on the x-axis, what we're showing is the share of variable renewable energy as a share of total generation. The y-axis is showing the capacity factor for thermal generators. So your coal and gas generation units, how much are you using them? And you can see in the 2022, everyone except for one economy is less than 20% variable renewable electricity, and the capacity factor sort of clusters around that 50 to 60%. As you increase the share of variable renewable energy, you end up using your dispatchable units less. And so you can see that's why you see that downward trend to the right. As you see the variable renewable energy increase, the capacity factor on the thermal plants is reduced. The problem with that is you still have to pay for those thermal plants, and the per unit cost of electricity goes up. So this is one of the major reasons that as you introduce variable intermittent renewable energy, even though it is low cost for the equipment, the total cost of electricity goes up. And that's because of this effect, among other effects. You'll see there's a few outliers down there. Hong Kong, China, Papua New Guinea, and New Zealand are very low, but don't have a big issue because they're have so much hydro, and Hong Kong, China is importing electricity from China. So then finally, we wanted to look at the cost, and so what we did for that was we looked at the power and hydrogen sectors, which is where the real investment is on the energy transition. And so we looked at total costs for the APEC region from 2025 to 2060. We ignored all the costs before, we ignore all the costs after. And for APEC as a whole, we estimate $57 trillion to be spent on the energy system in the reference case between 2025 and 2060. If you go to the transition case, you can see a $5 trillion drop in fossil fuel expenditures, and then the green is the increased capital expenditures primarily for the wind and solar and nuclear, and then also the, it's the orange is the power sector cost, and then it is hydrogen is the green is the hydrogen cost. So you can see how hydrogen is such a major component of the cost for just a few economies, but in the APEC total, very meaningful. So that concludes my summary of our results. The report is online, so you're welcome to look at the specifics. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Yasmin Fouladi, to talk about China and Southeast Asia.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you very much to CSIS for hosting us today, especially Jane and Madeline for all their work in helping us prepare for this event. In addition, it's so nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience here to learn about energy. So today I'll be covering some key result takeaways that we have from the China and Southeast Asia portions of our Outlook report. Okay. So first we'll start with China. Okay. So looking at the end-use energy demand by sector for China, China is the world's largest energy consumer and is a central driver of global energy demand, reflecting decades of economic growth, industrialization, and urbanization. Its consumption is projected to peak in the early 2030s before declining due to various energy intensity and energy efficiency improvements. As you can see by the red color, the industrial sector remains the most significant consumer throughout the projection period, though its demand is projected to fall as China shifts from intensive industrial subsectors to more services, as well as due to efficiency gains. In the target scenario, you can see in the blue that transport energy is reduced, and that's mainly because of EV adoption and greater public transit usage. In addition, if you look at the yellow color, the building sector in China is poised to grow the fastest, and that is due to higher residential energy demand as well as increased data center energy demand. So now let's look at the end-use energy demand by fuel type. So by 2060, the share of electricity is projected to reach 44% in the reference scenario and exceed 50% in the target scenario, while the combined share of fossil fuels declines from 62% in 2022 to 45% and 31% respectively across the two scenarios. In the reference scenario, gas is poised to replace coal as the second largest end-use energy source, as it has lower emissions and higher efficiency. However, to further promote decarbonization in the target scenario, it will be further phased down after peaking in the 2030s. In addition, we can see that renewables are increasing over time as China proceeds with its energy transition. So to look at electrification, energy demand grows across all of China's end-use sectors as it shifts towards greater electrification. Coal's role in the power sector is projected to decline over time as nuclear steadily replaces coal as the baseload fuel in China. Coal share of generation falls by about 60% today to below 10% by 2060, although China still maintains coal usage for grid stability. Renewables, such as solar and wind, expand significantly in both scenarios, as can be seen by the yellow and the dark blue colors. It provides over half of the electricity by the end of the projection period in 2060. These variable renewable sources are also supported by stable hydropower output. In addition, gas-fired power expands to provide both balancing and flexibility as wind and solar scale up. Looking at the carbon CO2 emissions for China, China's energy sector-specific CO2 emissions are projected to decline over time, and this is propelled by enhanced energy efficiency, increased deployment of low-carbon fuels, carbon capture and storage, as well as an accelerated phase-out of coal, allowing for China's 2030 carbon peak target to be achieved ahead of schedule. However, attaining China's 2060 net zero objective will necessitate the implementation of supplementary carbon sequestration strategies across both the energy sector and other non-energy sectors. So to provide a summary of our China results, China's energy demand is entering a structural turning point with its final energy consumption peaking around the 2030s. The industrial sector remains the most significant consumer throughout the projection period, and the building sector is poised to grow the fastest. Electrification and low-carbon power dominate the transition. Further, coal, oil, and gas play declining but strategic roles in China, shifting from growth fuels to supporting system flexibility, industrial feedstocks, and energy security during the transition. Grid flexibility and system integration are critical challenges, as they will require major investment over time in the transmission, storage, and dispatchable capacity. And then to meet China's net zero goal by 2060, it will require action not only in the energy sector, but beyond the energy sector, such as through negative emissions and broader economy-wide measures, as China continues its energy transformation. So now to proceed with Southeast Asia. Okay. So in Southeast Asia, population growth combined with favorable demographic structures, such as a growing young labor force, supports economic expansion alongside industrialization and urbanization. These effects are most pronounced in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines, which are expected to derive substantial benefits from demographic dividends. As Southeast Asia's largest economy, Indonesia will be the largest contributor to population and economic growth. In contrast, Malaysia, Thailand, Brunei, and Singapore are projected to see comparatively slower growth due to aging populations and more modest population increases. Because of this, demographic dynamics will therefore be a key determinant of future energy demand trajectories and associated emissions pathways across the region. Now, to look at the energy demand by sector in Southeast Asia, economic growth will drive these increases in energy demand across all sectors in all of the Southeast Asian economies. As can be seen by the red color, most of this increase comes from the industrial sector, which constitutes approximately 60% of energy demand in both Indonesia and Vietnam. By the end of the projection period, Southeast Asia is expected to electrify most of its energy demand. In target, by 2060, economies such as Singapore and Brunei could reach around 80% electrification, whereas other Southeast Asian economies range from between 40 to 60% of electrification, depending upon the year and the scenario. Okay. So because industry constitutes such a large portion of end-use energy demand, I'm going to delve a bit further into this. Industrial energy demand increases across all the economies through 2060, but it's lower in the target scenario, and this is due to enhanced energy efficiency, accelerated electrification, as well as other structural shifts. With the demand growth concentrated in energy-intensive subsectors such as iron and steel, chemicals, and non-metallic minerals. To note, due to the way that some Southeast Asian economies report industrial data, subsectors such as machinery, mining, construction, and non-ferrous metal production are grouped under others in Indonesia and Malaysia. Malaysia does not include a subsector breakdown for its industrial sector, which can make analysis a little more challenging. Looking at these economies, Indonesia is the largest industrial energy consumer amongst the group. Its energy use is concentrated largely in the iron and steel subsectors, and which have the highest relative growth amongst all the subsectors. and it's driven by infrastructure development and rising manufacturing demand. In particular, for Indonesia, nickel production is a key source of energy demand, and that is folded into the others category in the dark blue for Indonesia. For Vietnam, it's similarly true, where there are government policies that are in promoting industrialization and modernization. Thailand, though, exhibits a slightly different situation. For Thailand, the growth is mainly in the food and beverages industry, which is in the others category. In addition, petrochemicals dominate industrial energy demand in Thailand. So now to look at electricity generation by source in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's power transition is characterized by rapid capacity growth, rising variable renewable energy uptake, and a reliance on thermal dispatchable capacity. Southeast Asia's economies are projected to continue relying on fossil fuels due to their low cost, abundant supply, and critical role in ensuring stability and reliability of power systems. For Indonesia and Malaysia, they are projected to capitalize on their domestic coal and gas resources in their power generation mixes throughout the outlook period as a way for them to balance both security and affordability. Throughout the projection period, Indonesia continues to rely on coal, but integrates technologies such as CCS and hydrogen blending in the target scenario to lower emissions. Gas generation is expected to continue playing a key role for Thailand and the Philippines, which results for them on a higher reliance on LNG imports amid declining domestic production. For Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, they are leveraging their solar and wind energy potential, with plans to phase out coal in their systems by 2060 in their target scenarios. This transition will likely necessitate an increased reliance on natural gas or other dispatchable sources to maintain high dispatchable power capacity. In addition, there are several Southeast Asia economies that have expressed plans or are actively exploring nuclear energy, either through large reactors or SMRs, as part of a long-term energy strategies to diversify their electricity mix, enhance energy security, and reduce emissions. So looking at the emissions projected for Southeast Asia, the energy transition policies for this region are expected to lower CO2 emissions, which can be seen in the target scenario, but further measures are needed to meet their emission goals. Given that the power sector in the aqua color is the largest contributor to emissions, decarbonizing the power sector through renewables, lower carbon fuels, CCS, hydrogen blending, or other grid reforms is key for achieving meaningful emissions across Southeast Asia. So to sum up our key takeaways for the Southeast Asia region, Southeast Asia's economic growth and development, influenced by its growing and young labor force, will lead to higher energy demand across all sectors. The industrial sector is the main source of energy demand across most of these economies, and then electricity demand rises across all sectors, in particular industry and buildings. And then for Southeast Asia to meet its additional demand and maintain fuel security, continued reliance on fossil fuels is expected. However, as we saw from the emissions slide, doing so would prevent meaningful decreases in emissions in the reference scenario. But in target, utilizing CCS or hydrogen blending is a pathway to lowering emissions. For Southeast Asia, given the diversity amongst the economies there, the energy supply pathways diverge for these economies, reflecting their differences in their domestic resources, LNG, and other renewable integration potential. And as we saw on the previous slide, the power sector is the main contributor to emissions. So that will be key for lowering emissions over time. Okay, thank you all so much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, both Glen and Yasmin. And I really sort of asked them to gave them pretty sort of unfair request to, pack this 21, very diverse economies into this 5-minute presentation. And I also meant to mention that, also Russia is part of APEC. It's a very diverse economy. But before we get to some of the China and Southeast Asia related, as you undertook this, work for the 9th edition, if I'm not mistaken, the 8th edition came out back in the fall of 2022. Yes. So I'd love to hear, from you, what are some of the key changes that you've observed as you did the the work this time? Just, whether, by themes or by fuels, what come to your mind?
No, thank you for that question, Jane. And one of the main changes, of course, was that in our 8th edition, we were assuming more progress on the energy transition than would actually happen. So we had an inflection point in the outlook, and so we had to flatten that out, given what's actually happened the last few years. And then what we needed to do was, because of these issues associated with electrification, we had to do a lot more care on how we were modeling the electricity sector. And so that's part of what I was just referring to in terms of the dispatchable power. We also had to be able to model the batteries and other energy storage sources. And also in transportation, the electric vehicles was especially important to be able to try to capture what's going on in each economy. And of course, what it highlights is some economies are very different, particularly the US versus China. It's a very interesting distinction between the electrification of the transport sector and those economies. So those are the primary differences.
Great. And quickly, I guess, before I forget, so, Russia, obviously Russia is also a member. Like and I would imagine they're going through quite a dynamic sort of economic transition, et cetera, with what's happening. And how does your work,
And actually, this was a little bit of a surprise to me, because I thought as the US and Russia and China sort of butt heads a little bit or disagree about things, I was assuming that that would really affect our work. But because APEC is a consensus organization, it actually, we've still had very strong participation from Russia and China, because a majority of the economies can't pass a communique over an objection of any single member. And so we found that Russia has been more involved than I would have expected. We still have a hard time getting data out of Russia. So that's, there's still an issue there, but they do have a lot of interest in our work, and so we appreciate that.
Yes, how about any sort of major changes or even surprises as you look at China and Southeast Asia supply-demand outlook through 2060 compared to the 8th edition?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. So I actually wasn't at APERC yet during the 8th edition, but I could still talk about some surprising things we found while doing this round. I thought what was interesting to me was looking at the government policies, which we did our best to model in the target scenario. We see some economies in Southeast Asia really pushing forward with their energy transition. For example, Vietnam hopes to fully eliminate certain fossil fuels in their target scenario by 2060. And then also, while there aren't goals set policies yet for nuclear or projects that have fully established nuclear in the region, there is interest in Southeast Asia for that. And then regarding China, they're constantly coming out with new policies. And then, as we all know, their next 5-year plan is set to be released. We saw a bit of a preview last year, but I think the full plan comes out in March of this year. So it'll be interesting to see how that will impact the energy sector going forward.
Yes, yeah. And I think, yes, I'm really excited, sort of looking forward to seeing. The details always tell you quite a bit about their vision and ambition and everything with the 5-year plans. And I definitely have a lot of questions about actually the electricity sort of the end use side. But before we get there, when we look at sort of oil, gas, and to some extent coal, fossil fuel side, supply demand dynamics, what's sort of the general scope of an intra-regional trade, or what is the type of assessment that you undertake in your work?
So we actually don't try to model the trade between each of the individual economies. We're just looking at the import dependence or export capabilities of each of the economies. So we don't try to track where LNG would go or where coal goes, for example. And I think one of the things that is a remaining issue is we do see some increased interest in LNG and nuclear in Southeast Asia, the rapidly growing economy, but there is still a strong reliance on coal. And so you're seeing that especially in Indonesia, where there's a real reluctance to shut down the coal plants. So in their policies, they're projecting that they'll try to do some sort of carbon reduction from existing and new coal plants.
And if I'm not mistaken, in some of the, I guess, 2060 reference case scenarios, I guess the refined product share is to shrink a bit. Did I get it right that there'll be sort of a huge sort of effort to transition to more electrification?
It is the electrification of the, yes. And so that also was a challenge in trying to think about what was going to happen in the refining sectors. And so, for example, given their cost competitiveness, we just increase exports from the U.S. as opposed to closing refineries, whereas in other economies like Australia, closing refineries, and Japan closing refineries as a result of this.
So now let me get to some of the themes that were sort of introduced, but not, I guess we're kind of saving it for the conversation portion of it. One is the data center related. I think you mentioned that the building sector end use is expected to grow. When you look at data from the International Energy Agency work, for example, the demand or the data center share in electricity demand has been growing, but it's currently about 1.5%, if I'm not mistaken, of the global electricity consumption. But it's supposed, it's about to double between now and 2030. But it's, I think it's very much driven by the U.S. and China and perhaps select countries. Not everyone will be having data centers, right? But so I'd love to hear you sort of elaborate a little more about how the picture may look like within Southeast Asia. And I think you picked a couple of the countries, but if you can go into further depth, that'd be great.
I can do that if it's all.
Yeah, especially since Glen recently was in Southeast Asia.
So one of the things we have in our projections is this very large growth in Malaysia in data centers. But when I actually went and presented it to them, the economic ministry said, well, we did think we were going to use a lot more for data centers, but when we realized that the hyperscalers weren't going to contract for more than 5 years, we realized they just wanted our energy resources. They didn't really want to help our development or help our technical understanding, and so they'll be scaling that back. So I think you're finding that there actually be less growth in the data centers in Southeast Asia than we had originally thought. So yeah, it's just sort of building something without a long-term contract for the power is just not going to be interesting for those economies.
And about China in a data center space, I think there's a national plan that came out a couple of years ago that says computation will happen in the east, and then I think the basically citing of the less sort of a real-time energy consumption will be happening in the west, where there'll be less of a sort of an immediate needs for. So I'm always curious as to how all these economies, including the U.S., but trying to really achieve more energy with less emission. And do you have a sense as to how China may be trying to address some of the data center power requirements in between now and 2060?
So I should start by saying, obviously, it's very uncertain, the data center demand. And 2 or 3 years ago, we had a workshop in Hong Kong where they were worried about increased data center demand. And when you looked at the numbers, the efficiency gains in the data centers were exactly offsetting the increased data usage or the number of servers. And so how efficiency will play in this is going to be very important. And then, of course, what the what the AI is used for, and now I'm really getting to an area I don't understand, but I think the Chinese might be focusing more on sort of industrial applications and robotics, which may be less power intensive than sort of the inference logic AI. And I'm definitely talking about things I don't know about. But so over the next couple of years, we're really going to see. We know that there's a lot of applications for U.S. power in the U.S. And so trying to understand how real those are. Is this going to be a little bit like all the LNG export licenses where they don't all come to fruition and people are just applying to make sure they have a place in line? Or does that represent real demand? And I think that's something we're still trying to understand better.
Yes, yeah. And it's something I think we're all sort of learning in real time, seriously. And also, obviously, looking at the United States, there are all these announcements between nuclear tech companies and hyperscalers, and it is exciting, but at the same time, I mean, when the outlook, demand outlook comes in a range, you always have to be, just take a closer look rather than getting too excited or too depressed or too worried, if you will. But the other power-related, sort of a thematic takeaway for me is how not just China, but Southeast Asia will be having quite a bit of electrification of the transportation sector, right? Unpack a little more about, sort of what are sort of the scope and pace in some of the individual economies? Is it more of a mandate driven? How much of it is because of the cost competitiveness of some of the EV units that are out there in the market these days?
So I think in China, it's clearly policy-driven, clearly related to energy security and trying to reduce the dependence on imported petroleum, and so being very successful. When you look at Southeast Asia, it's an interesting mix because they do want to have the electric vehicles, but they also want to manufacture, or at least capture some of the value associated with that. So in Indonesia, they're going to want to use their own batteries. And Thailand's going to want to make its own EVs. And so how that works, that's obviously going to slow how rapidly it ramps up. The other thing that was sort of very interesting to me is in a place like Indonesia, there's very few electric motorcycles, which was very surprising to me. And it's partly because the incumbents making the motorcycles, primarily Honda and Yamaha, have dealer networks that are resisting changes to the electric vehicles. So I think in Southeast Asia in particular, even though because it's a warm climate, EVs are very susceptible there, the distances aren't as far, very attractive. It may be slower than we think. But China's clearly the driving factor.
How does the urbanization as sort of a trend affect this, or does it, at all?
Right.
Yeah.
So I would think that it would tend to lower the distances and make the electrification also more economic. But I don't think that's a major driver on this part.
Do you want to add anything about some of the Southeast Asian?
Yeah, sure. I think Glenn covered it well after having gone there most recently. But yeah, going back to China and its EV uptake, the latest government policy that was announced on EVs, I think it said, it was released in 2020, and then it was a 15-year timeline out to 2030, where they said that they hoped that 20% of sales shares would be EVs in China. And then more recently, during their NDC announcement, they announced that by 2035, that EV sales shares would be mainstream. So that could lead to higher EV adoption in China.
Yes, yeah, and it is really an interesting story. And to some extent, I always think of, earlier there was also a lot of discussion about the hydrogen fuel cell, based vehicles, and then, but there's a lot of technology advancement that also translates into the cost and then, the pace of adoption in different economies, and really still fascinating area to keep watching. The other thing I wanted to hear your thoughts is sort of, I guess, overall though, it is the key trends, as far as key trends go. So, there's some countries obviously have more of a top-down approach. The others, for example, because of major change in legislation or something overriding, like when you do this work for such diverse group of economies, like what are some of the unique features that go into your work? Just not just survey, but the analyses and also just coming up with such a long-term projection.
So we do work very closely with each of the economies because it turns out the overall report does need to be, each economy has to approve our report as a consensus organization. So we are working with each of the individual economies. And so it does provide a lot of insight in terms of working at the technical level with these economies as they try to find ways to implement the energy transition. I think one of the key insights that's at least came from me is on the hydrogen side. And just the production of hydrogen, even if you have very low cost electricity, the efficiency losses are so large that if you have low cost renewable energy, you'll use that electricity as electricity. You're not going to want to go through an electrolyzer and then use the electricity to use the hydrogen to turn a turbine. You're only getting out a quarter of the energy that you started with. So the hydrogen then becomes much more specialized. And so the EVs, for example, just make more sense than trying to take the hydrogen where you only have 25% of the energy still to put that into vehicles. So the hydrogen then gets constrained to those mostly island wealthy economies that don't have a lot of renewable energy. So you're talking about Chinese Taipei, Japan, and Korea that don't have a lot of renewable energy potential but want to reduce their carbon emissions. They're looking very seriously at hydrogen. But then they're also saying, can't you find a way to reduce the cost of the hydrogen? And because of the efficiency losses, which get even higher when you then try to transport the hydrogen from Australia or from Chile and Peru, it's just going to be very hard for that to work. So I think that's one of those areas where the costs are just so large, and it's hard to, given the efficiency losses, with all the conversions, it's hard to imagine that really taking off.
Thank you. Now, I think we have a little over 10 minutes left, so let me invite the audience to ask questions you might have. And please state your name and you're welcome to share your sort of reaction, but then also ask the question in a form of question at the end. Please, Jan. And the microphone will be coming around.
I'm Jan Mears with Resources.
Yeah.
I'm Jan Mears with Resources for the Future. I only saw one reference to geothermal. I recognize that at least in most countries, there's probably not very much at this stage, but are you sensing that, say, in your next edition, you'll be willing to say much more utilization of geothermal in the 2050 to 2060, since you go out that far, than you're showing today?
Yes. So a couple of the economies are enthusiastic about geothermal, the Philippines, for example, and also Indonesia. A lot of enthusiasm for geothermal. But then you ask them, well, how much are you actually going to produce? And it turns out to be a small number. So we do look at the geothermal, and there is potential, but it turns out that either because of the cost or because just it is it's a lot like oil and gas. Sort of need to drill it and produce it, and then make sure you're maintaining the reservoirs. I just think it's not going to be that major. That's my impression, having visited these economies. So they do like the geothermal, but the resource, they're just not talking about programs large enough to compare to the amount of electricity demand they have.
Anyone else? Yeah.
My name is Sang-gil Park from the Center for the National Interest. Okay, regarding the nuclear energy in the region of Southeast Asia, I saw that substantial amount of nuclear power in the projection. And then my question is, who might be the technology provider on that region?
So I think each of these economies is really trying to evaluate sort of what technology they want to use and then who they would get it from. So So I guess I don't have very much to say about these Southeast Asian economies, who they're going to end up buying it from, but they are wrestling with this issue of, do I purchase a traditional large-scale, economies of scale, conventional reactor, or do I look at the small modular reactors? In Indonesia, they're looking at the small modular reactors primarily because they're an archipelago, so they have these islands that are a long way from generation. So that may be how they enter the nuclear markets, to the small modular reactors. But I'm sorry, I really can't tell you who they're going to buy them from.
It's actually really also interesting question, because APEC itself has some of the leading global technology suppliers as member economies, and then a lot of potential buyers as well. So yes, yeah, that's definitely a great, interesting question. Adam, please.
Thank you very much, Jane, and APERC for the nice presentation. Adam Semensky, Senior Advisor at CAPSARC. Glen, during your initial remarks, you mentioned that you might want to elaborate a little on the decline in the percentage of dispatchable power.
Yes, yes.
And it looks like a lot of the electricity in APERC is going into industry, and what's the appetite in industry and data centers for non-dispatchable power?
Right. So thank you very much, Adam, for that question. I think what's happening in a lot of the APEC region, as I mentioned, especially the non-OECD countries, is they're seeing that sort of we're having these struggles. And I think Australia actually is an economy we can learn a lot from. They have very ambitious renewable energy, solar and wind goals, and yet they also had the experience of the 2016 blackout in South Australia. And so that really hangs over them. They're really trying to understand. So in addition to this issue of the costs increasing because you need the dispatchable power, there's also the issue of physical inertia in the system. And also the power electronics and the software, the control software for the batteries and the inverters. It turns out that it's a very complex system, and so you can have these very rare but important events where the interaction of these control systems will create low frequency oscillations that occasionally resonate and trip off parts of the system. So I believe that's what happened in the Iberian Peninsula, for example. So I think thinking about the grid as an integrated system. It's not a plug-and-play system where you can just take out a gas plant and put in a solar panel, or take out a coal plant and put in a wind turbine. And looking at the system as a whole, and then making sure you've tested the software of these different power electronics is an important part of that. So in addition to just the raw issue of having these dispatchable units that you're not using very much, and especially if you get down to 40% or below, you really can't even operate them at that level. And so how to think about how do we get inertia in the system. The Australians are looking at synchronous condensers, taking an armature and just bleeding electricity off the renewable to keep it spinning, and then just that physical inertia of that 200 or 300 metric ton armature spinning really helps with the stability of the system. So it's going to be a key challenge for all these economies going forward.
Any other question? So I do want to give you a chance to sort of, share maybe one, takeaway about your work, something that I think you conventionally think that, things that are easily underlooked about this very dynamic region as they go through this, more of a energy transition, but then also energy security questions. And all these economies have very vibrant population growth, the industrialization process, etc. So maybe 1 minute each, Glen, or 2 minutes each, maybe.
One of the things that's really strikes me is especially a number of these Southeast Asian economies used to have domestic production, but it's declining. And so they have to switch from using domestic natural gas, for example, to imported LNG. And so they go from something like $2 an MCF up to $10 an MCF. And how they manage that transition, how they work that into their system. I mean, I often want to encourage them to say you just ought to let the price of gas, even domestic gas, go up to world levels so you'll get more production. But of course, that's a complete non-starter with them. But that's one of the issues. In terms of energy security, they're very focused on natural gas. And is it just going to be too expensive? Obviously, the ramp up in prices associated with the Ukraine-Russian conflict is very much on their mind.
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, Glenn covered a very, very important topic. No, of course. I'm trying to think, but I think when we look ahead to the next iteration of our outlook, we definitely want to approach certain areas in more depth. For example, we tried our best to model data center electricity demand in this one, but I think as more data comes out, we can do more iterations of that in the next process. In addition, we did our best to model the cost of the transition in the energy system. However, we didn't look at the price of electricity or the price of power. But that's extremely challenging to figure out, especially when you have so many diverse economies and they have so many different price points. I think in addition, what we found when we were doing this modeling process is that when different elections take place and policies change over time, and trying to time that with our data modeling is complicated and complex. So finding a way to capture these policies and report them as accurately as possible while also figuring out rational projections, it will be key going forward. Yeah.
No, I very much appreciate all the effort that went in. And this is, I guess, the APEC collectively account for roughly, I guess, 60% of the global GDP, but then roughly about the same share of the global CO2 emissions, if I'm not mistaken. So to some extent, and of course the US is part of the APEC, but it's not just sort of the choices that they make for their own economic well-being, but then also collectively the effect that may have on the global pace of energy transition is something I think a pretty big question for not just for the policymakers, but also a lot of industry leaders as they try to figure out what are the sources, what are the type of investments they could be making, not just the technology side, but also infrastructure side, whether it's the grid or pipelines or even different components, efficiency, data center. But anyways, but thank you so much, Glen and Yasmin, for joining CSIS this afternoon. And thank you all for being here, and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks.